Chapter 11, Accountability and Ethics, Part 3. In this last PowerPoint presentation on accountability and ethics, we're going to look at a specific unethical behavior. So I'd said in earlier chapters we'd eventually get to racial profiling. Well, here we are. We're getting to it. And so let's study the ethics of racial profiling. First of all, racial profiling, if we really are seriously talking about profiling, and we'll see in a second, there may be a difference between profiling and biased policing, racially biased policing. But profiling, not racial profiling, but profiling generally, got started with drug courier profiles during the war on drugs. So these were, a Florida sheriff's deputy and his, or actually a Florida sheriff and his deputies created these profiles because they were noticing some common traits among the drug dealers that they were stopping. And so they started to develop a profile to help them better identify, at least that's what they were hoping they would do, better identify who's trafficking drugs, who isn't. And so they would look at a bunch of different factors. And now this still goes on somewhat today. For instance, I was in Curacao not so long ago, and we were talking to one of the customs officers who does the scanning at the airport. So when you pass your luggage through the scanner, this particular guy was in charge of the people who were scanning it and looking at it. And so he mentioned that one of the things that they look for on the flights from Curacao to the Netherlands, which are 8 hours long, what they look for are to see, in order to identify potential drug traffickers, is many of these traffickers are what we call mules who swallow bags of cocaine. Actually, not bags, I shouldn't say bags, but they swallow balloons full of cocaine. And so they might have them in their stomachs, and that's where they are going to have them. And so when they smuggle them. So one of the things that will fit the profile of a drug trafficker on one of these flights, these long flights, is if they don't eat anything or if they don't drink anything. Now, I know that most of you have probably been on planes and you know that you don't turn anything down. If they come back through the aisles with those peanuts, you're going to grab them even if you don't like peanuts. And so it's going to be highly unusual then that someone's going to be on a very long flight and they're not going to eat or drink. Well, why aren't they eating or drinking? Because they don't want to, for lack of a better word, they don't want to crap out the balloons of cocaine that they have in their stomach while they're on the airplane. Because how are they going to, they're not going to re-swallow them unless they really wash them really, really well. But what are they going to do with it? So, they don't want to drink, they don't want to eat, and they don't want to go to the bathroom. So when the flight crew notices somebody who is doing these things or not doing these things, as the case may be, is not drinking, is not eating, is not going to the bathroom, then they're going to probably identify the authorities at the airport where they're landing that this person should be checked a little more closely. So this is really, profiling in a sense. You're looking for people who aren't drinking, aren't eating on long flights, aren't going to the bathroom. You're looking for certain characteristics. So there's really nothing inherently wrong with profiles. We have FBI profilers who do profiling on the basis of psychology. But where it gets wrong is when we start using race and other things other than true indicators, like not going to the bathroom on a long flight on a plane, or drinking or eating. These are more closely connected with the crime. They're pretty objective. They're not tinged by racism or discrimination. So racial profiling, we have to ask, are we really talking about, in most situations, racial profiling where this officer is really looking for someone who's of a particular race so that the officer can stop them? Are they more suspicious of one race than another? Or is this racially biased policing? Meaning this isn't a real profile, but this is officers, when they encounter someone who is from a particular racial group, they may be harsher with that person. They may be more likely to search. So I'm not going to ask you to really be concerned about the difference between racial profiling and racially biased policing. For the sake of this PowerPoint, I'm going to talk about racial profiling, even if it is more accurately racially biased policing. So with racially biased policing, again, the police officer doesn't have, a particular profile in mind, but just treats a particular race differently than another. We're going to focus more on what would be more akin to racial profiling, where the officer is really using race as a surrogate, as a stand-in for suspicion, and the officer is really targeting particular individuals of a particular race. So what we're really asking is, are the police really overemphasizing race, or are they using it as a proxy? And what I mean by this is, do the officers, let's say, this is at an airport and it's the security officers, do they automatically assume when they see someone of a particular race that that person is a criminal, that that person is a drug dealer? Do they automatically assume that? Are they using race as a proxy for drug dealing? Well, if you assume that everyone who's of a particular race is a drug dealer, you're not going to be very efficient in your searches. You're not going to do a great job. And so we'd really rather that you are more accurate and you're looking for objective things that aren't race related. Now, there are situations where you can consider a person's race. It is not, I really want to stress this, it's not illegal for an officer, and it's not racial profiling in some situations for an officer to actually consider a person's race. So, if we're going to look for white supremacists, we're going to look for white people, okay? If we're going to look for the Klan, we're probably going to look for white people. If we're going to, if the Black Panthers make a comeback and they're more violent than they were in the past, and we're going to look for Black Panthers, well, then it makes sense to look for black people. So we look for white people if it's if it's going to be the KKK, we look for whites. We look for blacks if it's going to be Black Panthers. So in those situations where maybe it's, it's someone has committed a crime and witnesses are describing that person as, if someone was to describe me, they would say, okay, he's a tall, 6'3", white guy, blah blah blah, etc., etc., etc. So it would be okay for the police to look for a white guy who's 6'3", rather than everybody from every race. So race can be used, but is it overemphasized, or is it basically a substitute for criminal behavior, saying, I think everybody who's of this race is a criminal? If you're doing that, then you're probably racist, and you are probably engaging in racial profiling. With race, overemphasizing race, it may just mean that maybe you're not really racist, but for whatever reason you are, looking at one person's race in a more suspicious way than another person's. So you're not using it necessarily as a proxy. You're not saying everybody who's of this race is a drug dealer, but maybe you're more suspicious just because you're encountering somebody from a particular race. Is the discrimination, the bias, is it caused by general societal discrimination or individual discrimination? So when we talk about racial profiling, we soon learn that it's pretty complicated. So what's the cause of it? Is it general causes in society? Things like, in America, we had slavery for 200 plus years. We then had segregation, racial segregation for a long time. We've had a lot of anti-immigrant policies. We've seen them resurface recently. All of these kinds of things. So does that produce discrimination in employment? Does it produce discrimination in housing? All these kinds of things. So are the police officers really responsible for racial profiling, or are they kind of like the people who scoop up after the elephants during a parade? Are they, the last ones coming through? And so it's not really them that's causing the major problems in society. It's not them who's causing, a disproportionate number of minorities to live in high crime inner city areas. And so if they police aggressively in those areas because they think aggressive policing works, are they really being discriminatory, or are they responding to consequences of discrimination in the broader society? So that would be macro causes. Micro causes would be, yeah, the officer doesn't like people of this race, or the officer thinks that anyone of this race is a drug dealer or a murderer or a rapist or whatever it might be. So we look at the individual officer. It's unlikely that we're going to have outright, overt racism among police officers. We might still encounter it, or the police officers might keep their racist thoughts to themselves, not express them. But as far as someone who's willing to just, lay out a racist rhetoric that would stretch from one end of the world to the other, those people are probably not very common anymore. Again, unless they hide it very well. So they could be if they hide it. Because, our background check should have identified them. Supervisors should, be paying attention to them when they're on the job, all those kinds of things. Is racial profiling ever justifiable? What happens if it's producing, success using a racial profiling? It's producing success 90% of the time, and we define success by saying it was connected to a crime. So if that was the case, if racial profiling actually did work, if after 9/11 people talked about the crime of flying while brown, meaning if you were from the Middle East or from Southwest Asia, any region where maybe you were Muslim from that area especially, so if we throw in religion as well, was it reasonable to conduct a more thorough search of you than other passengers after 9/11? Well, and the answer is no. Even Commissioner Kelly, who was the commissioner of the immigration, commissioner of customs right after 9/11, Raymond Kelly, and then he was commissioner of the New York City Police afterwards. Even he said racial profiling wasn't justifiable. He said when he first came to customs, they were engaging in racial profiling, and he said he ended that practice and said, we're going to look for specific things. And so searches of passengers went down, but the amount of evidence seized went up. So when they stopped focusing on race and started focusing on characteristics, they actually found more evidence of wrongdoing, because it makes sense. The criminals are going to figure out the racial profiles. If they're smart enough, they're going to figure out, okay, if I'm going to traffic marijuana, I'm not going to have somebody who looks like they just came out of a Cheech and Chong movie with, pot plant stickers all over their beat up old Volkswagen van, blah, 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 some stereotype. They're going to have some little old grandmother traveling with her grandchild and having, cocaine in the diaper bag or wherever. And so, is racial profiling ever justifiable? No. And it sounded like I hesitated. I didn't. I should have said it even quicker. The answer is no. The reason for my hesitation is when race is used, it's not being used as when it is acceptable and is justifiable. It's that situation that I described earlier, that you have a specific description of a specific criminal and a specific crime. So you're not stopping all white people because there was a hate crime perpetuated by white supremacists, but you're looking for a particular white who committed the crime. We have a description of this person, maybe even a name attached to them. So that's different. That's not racial profiling. That would be justifiable, that you're using race in that way. Or again, maybe it's a gang that is really of only one race. It's, a white gang, it's a black gang, it's a, an Hispanic gang. Anything like that, then yeah, okay, maybe you can use, along with, and this is where we talked about race overemphasized, along with other factors, some tattoos, certain clothing, those kinds of things. If you brought all of that into the mix, then yeah, okay, you can use race. But that's not really racial profiling. Racial profiling is where you look for race and you target that race. Okay, so racially biased policing, where is it more common? It's more common in discretionary police actions than objective ones. What do we mean by this? Well, discretionary means, this isn't a radar stop. It's probably easier to identify the second one first. Objective stops. By objective, the police officer points the radar gun and stops people because they're over a certain speed. Well, a radar gun obviously doesn't pick up a person's race. So if the police officers are solely basing their decision on that radar gun reading, then we're not going to see any racial profiling, at least in the initial stop. But if they're basing it on pretext stops, remember pretext stops? We said it's where a police officer can't really pull you over for what they're interested in. So they may think that you're dealing drugs, they may think that you're, trafficking drugs, or maybe they think that you're drunk driving or whatever it may be. They don't have enough evidence to stop you for that, but they notice a minor traffic violation and they pull you over for that. And so in the video I assigned, you saw this going on where pretext stops were used and pulling people over because your license expired, or which is something you can't see from the car. There's no way you can know that until you actually stop the person, or maybe you had a vehicle violation or whatever it might be. But you can hide racial profiling behind those. And this is where we often see more bias in policing, in these discretionary stops more than the objective radar type stops. We can also find it in stops and frisks. New York City police were condemned, and they were told to stop their aggressive stop and frisk policy because the courts found that they were racially biased. They were stopping many more minorities than whites. And so the courts, there was a lawsuit brought against the police, and they were ordered to stop that practice, or at least change it. So stops and frisks, we might find that this is also where racially biased policing may come in. Consent searches. So what we mean by consent search is the police officer asks you if the police officer can search your bag, your car, whatever. And so we often see that, for instance, even with radar stops, that the initial stop may be free from bias. Whites and blacks and Hispanics are pulled over pretty much proportionate to their numbers in the population. But what happens after the stop is made? So you made a radar stop, that was unbiased. But now what actions do you take? And what a study out of New Jersey found was that something like 70 to 80% of the consent searches of vehicles on the New Jersey Turnpike occurred when there was a black passenger or driver in a car. So if there was someone, and even more specific, it was a black male. So if you were a black male, something like 70 to 80% of the consent searches, I think I may have said it a little differently earlier, but 70 to 80% of the consent searches that were performed were done against black males. And so, the stop may not have been biased, but now once you stop that person, do you investigate more fully, and are you biased according to a person's race? As I said, the pretext stops, they're more common they're more likely, not in every jurisdiction. In the video I gave you, they showed that not every jurisdiction showed bias in their policing. But if there's going to be bias, it's more likely in these pretext stops. In the use of non-lethal force. So we tend to focus on police officers shooting and killing suspects, and maybe disproportionately killing black suspects than white suspects, or Latino suspects than white suspects. But we often overlook use of non-lethal force. So what about the police and their use of, even just putting the person in cuffs? So do they do that more often to minority suspects than to white suspects? If so, then that's racial bias. We need to explain it. Do they push? Do they shove? And what we found in research is, they tend to use non-lethal force more often, more frequently, against non-whites than against whites. So there does seem to be some bias. Their words versus their actions. you know, there's an example of, in movies you see it from time to time, that I'm thinking the movie Crash a number of years ago, where they really examined racial tensions in LA. And so in that particular movie, Matt Damon played a cop who was really frustrated because his father wasn't getting good health care, and the person he kept speaking to and with the insurance was someone who he quickly identified as minority, through their name, through their accent. And he was really ticked off when that person denied insurance coverage for his sick father. And so he decided to take it out on a couple, minority couple. There was a call that came in for a carjacking. They definitely didn't fit the description. His partner even said they don't fit the description, but Matt Damon still, or I'm not sorry, not Matt Damon, but Matt Dillon pulled them over. And his words were very polite. He got the person out of the car, both people, and he said ma'am and sir to them. But then he conducted a really, really inappropriate search of the driver's wife. And it was clearly inappropriate, even though he was being respectful in his words. He was doing it on purpose to make the guy feel like, I control you. I can put you down. I control your wife right now, and I can violate her. And so that's an example of the words don't always, we think that the words will always be biased, but it can be the actions instead. It can be something less egregious. There was a study that was done that showed that the police tend to talk politely on the streets, or again, if you watch the racial profiling video, when the police officer was searching the one guy on the street who turned away from him, he was very polite to that guy, saying sir and thank you for cooperating with me. But the real embarrassment, the real injustice might have been the action, the stop itself, the search. That was the thing that was embarrassing. And so again, words or actions, how do we study them? How do we determine what's racially biased, what is? How can we fix racial bias, racial profiling, or racial bias policing? First and foremost thing we need to do is collect better data. We talked about this with the use of lethal force. We just don't have good databases for lethal force. Well, we don't have it for racial profiling. There is no federal law that requires or compels police departments to report information that might be helpful in determining if there's racial bias or not. The New Jersey study was one of the most, not the New Jersey, I apologize again, the NBC study that was done in the profiling video that I assigned was one of the most thorough nationwide surveys that has been done to date. We need to do even more. They're very expensive to do. They're sometimes very difficult, but police departments, we need to encourage them to conduct their own record keeping. And if we can't encourage them to do it, we need to command it through federal law, that they must keep records so that we can identify any problematic behavior. So that federal government oversight is really, really important. We just don't have it. It's been proposed from time to time, but never been passed. We need to make it easier for private party class action lawsuits so that they can be better funded, so that they can bring these lawsuits to identify and seek remedies against racial profiling among the police. We need to enhance training for police officers. So this includes diversity training so that they understand when they're doing something that's offensive, when they're doing something that's discriminatory. We need to teach them that racial profiling policing is usually dumb policing. That's what Commissioner Raymond Kelly called it at Customs, when he worked at Customs, that it doesn't work. Police officers often think it works. I'm going to pull over, this particular number of minority motorists, and every once in a while I catch somebody with drugs. But you would have probably caught somebody with drugs if you pulled over 20 grandmothers. Sooner or later, you're going to find somebody who might have drugs. So just because you occasionally find somebody who's done something wrong that's not good enough. We need to see, is it, is it the truth that when you pull over 20 people and you pulled them over primarily because of their race, that 18 of them had committed the crime you were looking for? Then we might say there's a close connection because you're succeeding at a 90% rate. But if you pull over 20 people and only one of them has done anything wrong, that's only a 5% success rate. That's dumb policing. And so we need to train officers to do better policing. We need internal oversight, so the police need to police themselves. They need to keep records. They need to monitor their police officers. They need to have a better complaint system so that people can complain and the police will fully investigate any kind of complaints about racial discrimination. Would diversifying the police force help? Well, we're going to take a look at that in the next chapter, but possibly having a more diverse police force, having the police force look more like the community might help both with respect for the community, but also respect from the community. And so maybe some of the issues that we deal with use of force and other problems would be rectified. That if we had a more diverse police force, then there's more likely that someone on the police force is going to identify behaviors that maybe even the other officers don't realize is discriminatory or are discriminatory. So those officers, because they're sensitive to it, because of their own background, can then say, look, we shouldn't be doing this. Community-oriented policing can help. If we get to form a true partnership with the community, we're less likely to racially profile them. We're less likely to be discriminatory towards them. We need to reduce policing for profit, and what I mean by that is that in many cities we have traffic fines, not just the forfeitures that you saw in the corruption video out of Tennessee, but we have many cities, we found this in Ferguson, Missouri, we found in many others, that get a lot of their income from fines and from traffic violations and other minor crimes. And when people who are too poor can't afford to pay it, then this may develop into a situation where an arrest warrant is out for them. It creates a worse situation. So it's not just that the police are arresting people because they've done something wrong, but when the police are really going out of their way to arrest, not because they really want to fully enforce the law, but it's because we got to make more money for the city. When they're policing for profit, when they're really trying to, the only reason we pulled you over is because we want your money, we want to seize your car, we want to do whatever, then this can lead to bias and racial bias as well. We found that often the people who are least likely to be able to pay their tickets we often have a racial connection to that. So it's class, but it's also race, both of the two. Finally, we need to promote greater equality in society in general. Now that's obviously not easy to do, but the more we try to end discrimination in society, the more likely the police are going to end racial profiling and racially biased policing.